Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
It's another Thursday night, and you're with Exploring the Bizarre on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. I'm Tim Swartz. Normally at this time, you'd be hearing Tim Beckley along with us, but unfortunately, Tim could not be with us tonight. He's under the weather, or he's been abducted by aliens. I'm not quite sure, but we're just going to have to press on without him. And I think that if we had a show that would help us pull through without Mr. Beckley, then tonight would be that show, because it's it's definitely going to be an interesting show, because we have with us tonight Paul Blake Smith and Adam Gorightly. Now, Paul has been on the show. Well, Adam's been on the show several times as well, and so has Paul. But Paul is well known for his appearances on our show, talking about his book, MO41, The Bombshell Before Roswell, and its sequel, talking about the possible Cape Girardeau UFO crash. And tonight, Paul is going to talk about his newest book. It's fictional. It's a romantic comedy, as Paul says, and it's called Sexy Alien Races. And Paul says that he's utilizing a different approach to reach readers on the topic of UFOs, this time concentrating on real-life sightings and sagas from the Las Vegas, Nevada area, which is the setting for his novel. And Adam Gorightly is with us because, I mean, he begged and pleaded to be on. Well, since we were going to be talking about this topic, and Adam is well known because of his interactions with the zany world of fringe culture and other counterculture things, and I tell you, sex and UFOs, I don't think you can get much more fringe and counterculture than that. So I want to introduce to everyone Adam Gorightly and Paul Blake Smith, and we're going to be talking about tonight live nude aliens. At least I think that's what we're going to be talking about. What do you think, Paul?
Close. It'll be what I've written is a little naughty, a little racy, but I am trying to reach younger viewers who may not be, or younger readers rather, who may not be that familiar with real-life UFO claims by now of, let's say, Bob Lazar, who claimed to have worked for Area 51 in the late 1980s. Well, that was getting to be 30 years ago, and there's a whole generation coming up that aren't familiar with his claims, and some other material from that Nevada region that's most interesting and is unfortunately really taken it on the chin lately due to this terrible mass shooting, which happened right across the street from the airport where they fly these government airplanes out to Area 51 and S4. Very odd and sad coincidence.
Well, now, what inspired you to come up with that title for this book? I mean, was it strictly just a advertising ploy? And it was like, oh yeah, they'll definitely buy this.
Well, I read a story in USA Today when I was on a beach vacation back around 2000, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. It said that people were going to baseball games, Major League Baseball games, and betting on everything, including the mascot races. These costume mascots run around the field and break a tape like they're running a horse race in the 8th inning. And people would come down to the wagon gate beyond the center field fence and start talking to the runners in their mascot costumes and saying, "You feel healthy today? You think you're going to win? Do you run well on a dry track or a muddy track?" And it was just hilarious. And yet it was sad because these are gamble-holics who will bet on anything.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I thought, yeah, this is comedy gold. I got to turn this into a screenplay. And I did, and I wasn't too satisfied with the results. And then I decided to wed the storyline of a fictional young man who fixes these races to clean up and make a lot of money with stories of real-life UFOs and ET sightings. His boss makes him go out and learn about Nevada area UFO crashes and extraterrestrial sightings and such in order to create realistic costumes to race during the 8th inning. So I put the two ideas together. Turned out really well, I think. I got a good review, and I've even got a Hollywood source who's interested in possibly optioning the book for a future movie, but we'll see how that goes.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, and good luck with that, because a lot of us have been involved with that, where you get a book optioned and then it just sets for years.
Yeah, it goes nowhere.
It goes nowhere until that option expires. So,
an option can be a good thing. At least you get some money up front.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I've known several people, though, who have, even though, like you said, they get money up front, they just get so frustrated, with the whole process. And, it's just like, it's, God, I can't remember what the statistic was, less than 1% of material that gets optioned ever gets, past the production stage. So
thanks for ruining my night.
Well, sorry, Paul. But if anybody out there who's a betting man, there's that 1% or less than 1%. So it's not like it's just 0.001%. So you got some.
If any community could use a few laughs, it's Las Vegas right now. And that's where I set the book, and it has a lot of humor in it, a little racy, and the costumes become more popular with the people of Vegas in the story when they decided to sex them up a little to get attention, and the crowds come in, they find it the more ludicrous and over-the-top looking, the more popular it becomes, and that's why it's sexy alien races.
Well, that's funny, though, because that really is pretty much the whole UFO mania in a nutshell, though, because if you go and I know, Paul, that you are well familiar with the very beginning of the modern day UFO era, and how it has changed so much since that time. It was fairly, nuts and bolts, back in the late 40s and early 50s. We were talking about the possibility of people visiting us from other planets, driving their very 50-ish looking flying saucers. They almost, had fins on them. They were so modern looking. But then, as time went by, the phenomena evolved and branched out into all kinds of different directions. It's amazing now to look at how diverse and interesting and weird the whole UFO field has become. So you're talking about how the costume makers decided to add a little pizzazz and sex to everything, and that brought in more attention, and that's really the way the UFO field has become. It's now a lot more it's more glitzy, it's more diverse, it's definitely a lot more interesting nowadays, I think. Wouldn't you agree, Adam?
Oh, sorry, got muted there.
No problem.
More diverse, you say, huh?
Well, I think so. I mean, you look at, when UFO researchers in the 50s, it basically was all, these are aliens from other planets. Now, I mean, you've got, interdimensional beings, time travelers, people from the inner Earth. Well, they had that, in the 50s as well. But I mean, there's just all kinds of. It's just a whole plethora of different things going on.
Well, I wouldn't say the interdimensional thing is brand spanking new. That that was something John Keel was talking about in the 70s, and Jacques Vallée to a certain extent. I don't know. Some of the diverseness you're talking about seems just like a lot of times to me, a lot of like you can call it UFO porn nowadays, or like a lot of outlandish stuff there. I guess I've become kind of a cynic here in recent years with all these stories about Stargates and super soldiers and stuff of that nature. I'm sounding curmudgeonly, aren't I?
Oh, well, that's okay. I mean, who can blame you, really? It seems like as time goes by, you just get wilder and wilder stories, and as Paul pointed out, you get these, kids who become interested in UFOs. And they see some of this stuff, the super soldiers, especially. That's one that's been catching in my craw recently, and they just take it as a matter of fact. Oh yeah, it's true. I read it. I read it on Google, so I know it's true.
Yeah. Well, this grand arc of ufology, Paul was talking about. Lazar and those stories, that seems like seems almost pretty recently. That was like a new wave, in the late 80s, and all that came in. That's when Hollywood really started latching on to a lot of these stories, all the Dulce Base and Area 51 and those legends that had been growing over the years with the Secret Pact and with the aliens, and all of that stuff got inserted into the X-Files, and a lot of that stuff that emerged out of Hollywood during that period in the early 90s, which that's almost 25 years now. But
I know, can you believe that?
I have a fondness for the old school contactees, just because of the innocence that came out of that period and all the colorful characters. And you probably know I've been working on a book with my friend Greg Bishop on the old school contactees, which were close to finishing after about 5 years. So
yeah, and I've been anxiously awaiting that book too. and
I'm going to share some snippets tonight as we get talking about sex and UFOs. I've written a couple things working on this contactee book, and it's kind of a who's who, where you have entries for a lot of the different contactees, and sex often comes up in a lot of those old school contactees. And also I wrote another article, it's been a few years now, that was published in the Dark Lore anthology that Greg Taylor puts out at Daily Grail, and this article was called Sex, Drugs, and UFOs. Touch on that a little bit as we proceed here.
Oh, that's great.
Well, the characters in my book discover somewhat the same thing when they start trying to make realistic alien costumes, as their boss insists upon. Well, are they male or are they female? And they ask each other, should we make malians or graylians or femalians or even she-malians if they don't have a particular gender? What exactly is landing and poking around on our planet and poking around on abductees and contactees? and it gets to be comical, but it does raise the question, do they have gender? Do they have male and female and reproductive organs when they, what various races come here? And what does happen in some of these abduction cases where they're trying to create hybridization, and create a new race, supposedly, according to some of these people? It's a pretty strange, wild subject.
Well, the early, as Adam was referring to, the early contactees with the Space Brothers and all that, their descriptions a lot of times of these characters, that they were almost androgynous, even though they would identify themselves as male or female. A lot of them were always reported as being beautiful and with fair of skin and blue of eye and all that. So yeah.
Don't forget Aura Range. She was tops in shapeliness and beauty.
That's right.
According to Truman Bethurum.
Yeah, Truman, if he was making all of that up, he sure had an interesting fantasy life. If Aura Range just simply was a product of a vivid late night imagination, because Tim Beckley's personal assistant Carol Ann Rodriguez did a drawing of Aura Range.
Right.
At one time that I think has been used. Oh, was it in Greg Bishop's book?
Yeah,
I can't remember.
I'm quite familiar with it. Well, I've seen it in a lot of places. Aura was a beret wearing space babe from Clarion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. For the most part, with the 50s, 60s contactees and the sexual component that was in some of their stories. Yeah, normally, pretty much across the board, these were all the human-looking ETs. It wasn't later until we got into the abduction period where the sexual experience seemed to change, became more of a some cases violent or bordering on even sexual abuse, with the probes and all of these things going on, and some of those experiences. Even though Whitley Strieber described his experiences as painful and frightening, also he felt that they heightened his awareness, and he learned from those experiences. It was, kind of a spiritual experience for him.
Were there sexual stories involving the so-called Nords, the Nordic type, humanoid-looking ones?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's quite a few. The main planets during the contactee period, they're either meeting visitors from Venus or Mars, or in the case of Aura Range, Clarion, which was hidden within our galaxy. But for the most part, they were the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, beautiful Nordics, or and then in some of the cases, they were described as olive-skinned or kind of Italian-looking space brothers and space sisters.
Yeah, Howard Benger, especially.
That's
I mean his contacts with the Nordics was extremely. Even though these early books, I don't think they could have gotten away with being very graphic or even talking that much about any kinds of sexual liaisons between them. But Howard made some pretty blatant references to
he kind
his
of
contacts.
Hinted at it.
Mm-hmm.
And the first experience at his Oh, it's like where he grew up as a child out in New Jersey or New York. It was like on a farm is when he met Marla, this beautiful, buxom, blonde-haired bombshell from outer space from Venus, who was like, he found her sitting on a rock. She's the most beautiful woman. She was supposedly 500 years old, but didn't look a day over 21. And it's kind of intimated that he might have been initiated at that point. This is from his book. I forget the name of his book now, but later in life he saw either the reincarnation of Marla, or it wasn't quite clear, but that ended up being his wife, Connie Minger.
Right. And Connie's still alive, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Howard passed away a few years back, but Connie's still in there. Yeah, I mean, and Howard, I mean, he divorced his first wife to marry her, and went on to make a badly produced record album of
music from outer space.
That's right. Dedicated to his otherworldly lover.
Gee, does that mean the 500-year-old buxom blonde is still available? She's still out there?
Yeah, she's still around. I don't. I think that living on Earth has maybe been a little bit hard on her. So
maybe
I don't think
My Harmony or
she doesn't quite look like she did in the 1950s. But
well, what's an extra 40 years? 50 years ago, if she's 500, if she's aging well.
Yeah, there you go.
Good point.
Has anyone else seriously ever reported such a thing that would corroborate such a wild story?
Not really. But there was a lot of those wild stories out there during the day, back in the day.
There was someone from South America who reported like a beautiful woman took him aboard and pleasured him, shall we say. And it was a rather famous story, I think back in the 70s. Does that sound right?
Oh, it was earlier than that. Villa Boas.
Yeah.
From Brazil. That was like, oh gosh, the late 1950s, I think.
I have passage right in front of me. It was 1957.
Okay, right.
When the 23-year-old Brazilian farmer was taken aboard a UFO. Apparently they slipped him some type of aphrodisiac, Mickey of some sort, and he was forced to have sex with, she was described as an attractive, red-haired, pointy-breast feminoid, and she was making odd animal-like grunting noises, which was always a peculiar part of that story.
Let me interrupt you here, Adam, because we have to go to our bottom of the hour break. We'll continue this conversation in just a few minutes on Exploring the Bizarre.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre, and I encourage our listeners that if you have questions for Paul or Adam, this is an excellent program to ask these questions. Talking about sex and UFOs, sex and aliens, or the trying to introduce people to the history of the flying saucer phenomena. This is a great way. So just send your questions to us through Tina, mental telepathy. I don't care. Just get it to us because we'd love to hear from you. So, Adam, I want to continue on talking about the Villa-Boas case because I think that was one of the first ones. At least, I mean, it may have not actually have been, like the first incident of that type, but it was the first one that actually somebody dared write about it. I think first place I read about it was, maybe Coral Lorenza wrote something up about it in one of her books. But that was quite that was a number of years after the case. I mean, nobody would dare write about that in the early 60s.
Yeah, it seems to stand out as perhaps one of the first quote-unquote abduction cases that had sex involved in the story. And it's quite different, if you look at the contactee era. That kind of started really in 52 with Adamski's sighting. So the Villa Boas was 1957. So it was, during that contactee period, but it was quite different than all of the contactee cases during that time.
Well, you had... there had been a period, I think, starting in, maybe 53, where you had a number of UFO sightings in South America and France, Spain, that deviated wildly away from the whole Space Brothers, friendly New Age type of contacts to these, landed saucers with little guys in spacesuits, coming out and sometimes actually attacking the witnesses. And then you had this case with Villa-Boas, where he was attacked, all right.
Yeah, Paul was asking, if there was any witnesses to a lot of these stories, and there was a lot of the contactees. It was like they were either making things up or they were con men. I think some of them believed their stories, but it was kind of a subconscious projection. But a lot of people were impressed by the Villa-Boas case. He was, people actually went out and interviewed him, and he seemed, like a solid witness. I think they might have even, I might be confusing this with another case, but they did a lie detector on him, and it seemed, his testimony seemed believable. There were no other witnesses to the case. I want to mention one other that happened in Brazil, and this was in 1979. It was kind of an odd one, too. A guy named, he was a 25-year-old Antonio Vieira, I think I'm saying that name right, witnessed a saucerland, followed by the appearance of some robots who abducted him and took him aboard their craft. And there Vieira encountered a repulsive female alien with bad breath. That's a nice touch.
No, it is. Huh?
He resisted, and in response, the robots took his clothes off and gave him an injection of some sort. In a lot of these cases, you have like drugs are involved. Same thing with Villa-Boas. Anyway, that injection kind of caused him to succumb. Then the robots covered him with an amber-covered oil, maybe, and followed by that, an alien gal did the old bump and grind with him. So it was similar to the Villa-Boas case. He was kind of forced into that.
What would be most suspicious if someone starts changing their story and then adding to it, sexing it up, making it really wild sounding, then you know that someone just wants attention or money for a book deal or a movie deal. And I'll point out real quick, Bob Lazar said that he was approached by a few Hollywood producers who offered him some substantial money for his story, but they wanted to sex it up and put in violent aliens attacking and everything. And to his credit, he turned them all down. He never changed his story. He sticks to the same story to this day, and he doesn't want it turned into some wild Hollywood production that fictionalizes things.
Well, that's often what they want to do. They want to have a love interest in the story. I know my friend Greg Bishop wrote a book called Project Beta, and it's really a spy story. It has to do with the whole Benowitz affair, and he was talking to some producers, and that always came up, and when they were discussing this, well, we got to put that love angle and write an extra character in here that's the love interest, that type of thing.
Oh my God!
And that you don't need that to make a good story, but there's a formula that people in Hollywood want to follow sometimes.
Well, it's like the movie that they made about the Travis Walton case, where they basically turned it into a horror film.
Yes. I didn't care for that at all. I bet Whitley Strieber, was he privately pretty upset with that finished result, that movie?
Well, he was like a co-producer, I think, of that one.
Because it was very different from his book, wasn't it?
It was, but I can't remember the name of the director, the Australian director, but the two collaborated fairly close together to produce that film. How many movies have you ever seen, supposedly based on, true life events in this field have come out satisfactory?
You hit upon the key word, based upon. That's what they'll put at the start of the movie, based upon a true story. Yeah, then they added a bunch of extra junk to it. I think the popularity of Independence Day back in, I think, 1996 caused Hollywood to really stand up and take notice. If you have evil aliens invading and a big fight and lots of drama, that's what they're looking for to copy off of that.
Well, there's, what's it called? The Awakening that came out last year. I think that was the title. They did a very good job with that. There's no evil aliens, no big explosions, no CGI, no overblown CGI. It was just an attempt to communicate with an alien race that came to the planet, and we had to learn their language, which it was nothing like anything that our feeble brains could even conceive. I mean, you're talking about something that a language that transcended time and space. So wrap your heads around that.
Did that do well at the box office? Was that a success?
It probably was, because it didn't cost that much to make. Oh. It was one of those types of movies where they spent, few $1 million on it. And when I say few, like maybe 20 million, something like that. So it probably did okay in the United States, but probably did better overseas, where it seems like anymore most movies make their money. But Paul, I wanted to ask you now, you brought up Bob Lazar, and for those of our audience who may not be familiar with Bob Lazar, do you want to tell us, give us an idea of who Bob Lazar was and why we're talking about him?
Well, Bob Lazar was a scientist, or claimed to be, and he certainly talks like a scientist. And some people dispute his scientific background, his training, and his knowledge, including Dr. Stanton Friedman, who's just almost up in arms. He says, "Oh, Bob Lazar is a fraud." However, Lazar came forward with an amazing story in the late 1980s, and it got a lot of airplay. And to this day, they still have an alien theme to their baseball team in Las Vegas, and the extraterrestrial highway, and talk of Area 51 still because of Bob Lazar, who said, "I worked on a captured alien spacecraft trying to understand it, reverse engineer it." He said he saw others in a large hangar, what we call S4, built into the side of a mountain not far from Area 51. And another interesting factor is that he said he was shown at one point a briefing document, and it had even photographs of gray aliens, autopsies, the slides, tissue sample results, and what appeared to be, had to have been information culled from communication, where they were from, how far away their planet is, why they are here, their various habits and what they think of Earth and religion and such. And he was allowed to read this on one day. So he has no tangible proof, as so often the problem in UFO stories. but he never changed his story. He refused to recant it. And I believe he came up with an element that was somewhat off the charts that he claimed was part of this spacecraft that he was working on. And in today's world, I believe they've discovered this element does exist, and it's something that somewhat supports his tale. And I believe Bob pops up every now and then working on some sort of, I think he's part of like the survivalist community in Michigan or something like that. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
He does live in Michigan. He's got a little company where he sells, I guess, electronics and various kinds of chemicals and things like that to I think a lot of defense contractors. I know that he was working on coming up with ways to power cars using hydrogen, but like a lot more efficient methods of doing it than what they currently have. But that's
he got fired by the government for taking some friends late at night out to the desert to watch test runs of these alien craft, and even try to record some, and that supposedly got him cashiered, and he was being followed around, and he felt like maybe his life was in danger at one point. It's interesting. The shows like Hard Copy or Inside Edition or A Current Affair back in those days decided to go out into the desert and see what they could record, and they found plenty of other people out there, and they got their videos, and there's some very interesting nighttime UFO images of craft going up in the air and moving around and zipping about in very strange non-human type formations, and that tend to lend credence to his authenticity. But then the whole thing just seemed to fade away, that no one could find proof one way or the other, and he just doesn't want to talk about it much anymore.
Well, people like Nick Redfern speculate that people like Lazar may actually have been deliberately fed, misleading information for whatever reason, to see if they would talk and who would pay attention to them when they did talk. I don't know. I mean, I've always been kind of fascinated by Lazar's case. I mean, I'm not one of the ones that's going to go and have a knee-jerk reaction one way or the other. Like, oh yeah, I totally believe him, or I totally disbelieve him. I always found it interesting because the guy is obviously highly educated, knows what he's talking about, yet he has no paper trail. It's like the guy never existed. He never went to school anywhere. The places that that he claimed he worked, there's no evidence that he worked there. Though somebody did find, I guess it was a what was it, like a
W-2 from doing some work for the government at some facility, maybe Los Alamos, something like that.
And I think somebody also found like an internal phone book that had his name listed on it. So obviously he was around. But we
have to ask ourselves: did the government scrub his past? And that's kind of scary on its own, isn't it? All of his past records from school or where he lived, they couldn't find much. Did the government come in and just take them away?
I would suggest this: if he, like you say, Paul, his story was consistent, but looking from the angle, if he was a quote unquote useful idiot, the whole thing about briefing papers has cropped up again and again in ufology over the years. People get to look at these briefing papers, but you can't make copies. You can look at them for a few minutes. I mean, that goes back to Benowitz and Bill Moore had that scenario. Linda Moulton Howe.
Right.
Same deal, with these, they'd get a little, a whiff of something, and, but, were they being led around by the nose? Were they just being used to muddy the waters about
and being
the test?
Promised footage and promised more information, and then it just doesn't appear, and then they end up looking rather foolish.
Well, there was, what was his name? I can never pronounce his last name. Enigberger? No, that's not it. Ennenager, yes, who was also, for people who don't know, he also produced the Lancelot Link television shows on Saturday morning.
Well, he was the, well, go ahead and tell the story.
He was promised footage from the Air Force for a documentary film that he was talked into producing it. He had no interest in it. He was going to do a documentary on something else, and he was approached by these high-ranking officials from the Air Force and said, "Hey, we've got these great UFO films, you ought to do a story on that." And he talked to a lot of people and was all set to produce this. And he was supposed to get, wing gun footage of UFOs and other top secret films. And then at the last minute, it was all pulled out from underneath him.
It was allegedly a landing at Holloman Air Force Base where the ETs actually came out of the ship, and he was Emmenager was actually shown some footage, but it didn't show that. It was more of a light in the sky type thing, and he was shown some stills, and he was promised the complete footage for their documentary, and I think this was like 75, and the same scenario that happened with Linda Moulton Howe, that they got kind of strung along over a period of time and got the rug pulled out from under their feet.
That was around the time of the Nixon Watergate scandal that may have had an impact on so much government corruption and cover-up, and what do we let out, what do we not. So that might have been a factor.
Well, yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's what Emmenager said, I think, in the film Mirage Men. If you haven't checked that out, there's an interview with him, and he does mention the Watergate period, and that might have been part of what was driving that at the time.
I'd love to hear what both of you think at this point of the Richard Nixon Jackie Gleason affair, in which they supposedly saw alien races in freezers on Homestead Air Force Base. What do you think of that tale?
I wish Timothy Green Beckley was here to talk about that, because that's one of his favorite stories. Because Jackie Gleason was very much interested in UFOs. Oh yeah, I mean he had like this huge library of UFOs, and supposedly, now I don't think that this story came from Gleason himself, but I think it came from his widow. Where she said that, again, it's a secondhand story, so you have to take it as you will. That he told her that he was golfing buddies with Nixon, and Nixon knew about his interest in UFOs, and he was just like, you want to know about UFOs? Come on, and he took Gleason to and do you remember, Adam? It was in Florida.
Homestead Air Force.
Yeah.
Homestead Air Force, right? And and in a underground facility, supposedly there was the the glass cases with the frozen aliens inside, and Gleason's widow, I guess, she swore that he told her that, and he was convinced that what he saw was real. It's hard to say. It's
a story. That's all you have.
Right. Yeah.
Jackie never came out and said, "Oh, that's a bunch of hogwash." He refused to comment on it publicly, which is very strange too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I probably would too.
Yeah, I think if it is a true story that it was his loyalty to his friend Nixon, that he wasn't going to go and reveal it publicly, but I mean his ex-wife, his widow, she swears that that's what he told her, and she believed him.
Said that he came home shaken and pale, and that he couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat for a long time, and he almost didn't work in show business for a couple of years, that it affected him so badly. I mean, if that is true, that's hard to fake that kind of emotional, upset kind of reaction to something which would be very human, I think.
You were going to say something, Adam?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, be interesting for a hardcore researcher to really pin down the dates when that happened, and confirm that both Nixon and Gleason were there at that time, and maybe whatever other cooperating information you could get. What I was going to add, Gleason had this awesome library, and I believe he had a house that was shaped like a UFO. Is that correct?
Yes, he did.
And he also had like an astounding. There's like 20 bathrooms in that place, probably because he was, or maybe it was bars. He had like a dozen or so bars in the house.
20 bathrooms.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Right.
He called the main part of the house, which was circular shaped, the mothership, and he had a garage that was circular shaped, and he called it the scout ship. I mean, he was just nuts.
He was into it, yeah.
Very much so, right? And I'm not sure, but I seem to remember, Beckley saying that his collection is still intact somewhere.
The University of Miami.
Is that where it is? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's great, because that's something that Beckley and I have talked about before on this show. So many of these collections, ended up disappearing or locked away in a garage someplace, and unfortunately, we'll have to leave it at that because we have to go to our top of the hour break. So we'll be back in a few minutes for more Exploring the Bizarre.
Exploring the Bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe, exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
All right, welcome back. Here we are in the second hour of Exploring the Bizarre with Adam Gorightly and Paul Blake Smith, and we are talking about UFOs and the kind of like the fringe elements almost. Well, heck, I mean, people might as well admit it. UFOs they're pretty fringy just by themselves, but it's hard to believe that there's a fringe element to what's already a fringe element. So we'll continue this conversation. It's very interesting tonight. So, Paul, you had a question that you wanted us to bring up.
Well, I'd like to know more. I'm sure your listeners would too, about what's happened to Robert O. Dean, who had a very fascinating story come forward, I believe, in the 1980s when he worked at the Army headquarters in France, the Allied headquarters. He said he was allowed to see a locked up, classified, top secret report that said the American government was secretly studying UFOs, had dead bodies recovered from crashes, some in Europe, and that there was various races. He counted at least 5, including reptilians and maybe Nordic types and grays, and some that looked very much like humans, could nearly walk down the street and not be recognized, which is a little frightening. And he has never wavered from his story. He has very fine military credentials, and he claims that part of what he was allowed to see, he would sneak it to the bathroom and write little crib notes and try to write a summary of what he read in this file without actually photocopying it. Then they would sneak it back into its cage and lock it up. This was during the graveyard shift overnight. And I was just curious, what do people in ufology nowadays think of Robert O. Dean, who has not changed his story?
I actually saw him speak one time in Indianapolis, and he basically told the very same story that you just referred to. I do know that he was in the U.S. Army as I think it was a command sergeant major, but don't hold me on that. He claimed that he had cosmic top secret clearance while in the military. Now, I have to admit, I had not heard that type of clearance before. So when I first heard his story, it was like cosmic top. That, to me, that just sounded like something, from science fiction, or something that somebody would say just to really embellish the story. But I found out later that there actually is such a clearance. Though I don't know if it is a U.S. military clearance. I think, if memory serves me, that's like a NATO type of clearance. His story is just so similar to these others that we were talking about. Bob Lazar and Linda Moulton Howe, where they were shown or had access to these secret, almost like history papers of the alien races, and how many are here and how long they've been here, and that sort of thing.
Recurring theme of crashed saucers.
Yes. That that has been one of the main points about I think practically all of these stories was supposedly validating the whole Roswell crash, and then some others that maybe aren't so widely known. I haven't heard too much from him for quite a while. Of course, he's got to be.
He must be getting up there, yeah.
Yeah, I think he's got to be in his 80s at this point. I do know that Wendell Stevens, the late researcher and writer, thought a lot of Dean. And
that doesn't impress me too much.
No, I know.
I would say that Robert O. Dean had some badass hair, as I recall.
Oh yes, he had quite a head of hair. I guess he rebelled against his military haircut when he got out of the service, didn't he?
But again, I mean, here you have somebody that seems to have a good background and is telling a story that is fantastic, to say the least. But that's basically it. I mean, how can they prove it? They can't. How can we prove it? We can't. So I mean, we're forced to take his word for it.
Yeah. He said that the U.S. military has conducted this survey, and they put it into the report that there have been attempted contacts between aliens who land, some at air bases. He said that in one Italian air base, a spaceship came down, and an Italian sergeant was approached by aliens, friendly as they may be. The Italian sergeant immediately wet his pants. He was so scared. He says, "That's what I read in the report. That's what it said." So he passed that along. But if so, what happened to this attempts at contact, and why don't we hear more of these types of stories?
Well, that's like what we were talking about in the last hour. With a guy who was trying to produce the documentary UFOs Past, Present, and Future. One of the things that he was able to do is that he was able to interview people, servicemen who were at the base at the time of the alleged UFO landing there. And I remember him saying that he was talking to one radar man, and he wasn't quite sure how he was going to approach just asking this guy. He kind of hemmed and hawed about what he was trying to ask him, and this radar guy just said, "Oh, you mean when the flying saucer landed at the base? Yeah, I was there." Just very matter of factly, and didn't really. I mean, yeah, it happened. So what? It seems to me that a lot of people who may have been involved in these types of cases I don't think they realize the subculture around UFOs that those of us who are very intimate with it, we'd be really surprised to hear about things like that. But I think some of these guys that especially in the military that had this stuff happen to them, they're just like, yeah, it happened. Why?
But what do we know about the radar guy? What did he see? Did he just see something on his radar, and there was a big buzz around the base, something went on, and he heard from somebody else, well, yeah, it was a disc-shaped craft, or some type of weird craft they hadn't seen before?
Well, I do remember them saying that most of the on-base personnel that weren't involved, with the activity and with the landing, were sequestered to their barracks and told not to come out. And I know that the radar men and people like that, they were in rooms without windows.
Yeah.
So a lot of the information that came to them probably was scuttlebutt. So who knows what may have actually have happened? Because we all well know how that sort of information can get around and how it can change. It's like the old game, telephone line. You'd play as a kid. As kids, you'd say something to one person's ear, and then by the time it made it through the line, it's fun to see how much it had changed or hadn't changed.
Well, we have so much wonderful technology today, and yet that's another problem. You can fake footage with CGI. A kid working from his home computer could come up with his own UFO footage and try to pass it off these days, and it goes viral. And another problem is there are lots of drones and aerial craft and strange-looking modern airplanes and helicopters and Harrier jets. And people mistake them honestly, or maybe try to fake something. And so we can't make advances in ufology without everything being totally clear, with eyewitnesses on the ground and some sort of hard proof and indisputable footage and maybe a government report. And it's still so very frustrating.
I don't think that we'll ever be able to make any advances on this subject, at least not unless whatever it is that's behind it all decides to reveal itself, and I don't think that's ever going to happen.
My friend Greg Bishop says if any breakthroughs are made, it's for people who are looking at something, scientists or whatever, something totally different that has nothing to do with UFOs.
Yes, yes. Oh, I definitely would believe with that. And I think, gosh, who was it? Was it Greg? Somebody I was listening to one time. The subject had been about artificial intelligence, and how it may actually take an artificial intelligence to figure it all out. Especially when it comes to the more paranormal aspects of the phenomena. And go ahead.
Well, I just in the field of ufology, you have a lot of people with different ideas. A lot of people who've made up their mind what the phenomena is, and that is kind of a roadblock to really discovering what it is. You need an open mind.
If President Trump released documents, film footage, still photos, Army stuff, official, and said, look, this is the real deal, or so they tell me, would people believe that even in today's world?
Oh.
Trump doesn't exactly have the most sterling reputation for the truth, but if it was military grade stuff and he's just saying, well, I'm passing this stuff along and you can absorb it all you want, would people understand that we are being visited by a few alien races, or would they still refuse to believe it?
I don't think people would. I don't think people would believe it. First of all,
well, some would, some wouldn't. It depends,
True.
My perspective has always been, with the whole UFO disclosure thing, it's like, just release the materials, the proponents of UFO disclosure, get the truth out there. But government is so compartmentalized, especially intelligence agencies. There's like 17 different agencies, and there's the need to know things. So the government doesn't know what it knows.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. I've speculated that at this point, whatever information had been gathered over the years has probably been lost. As you pointed out, Adam, I mean, everything is so compartmentalized that the people who took care of some of this stuff may, if there was ever like one or a small group of caretakers, have since passed away, and now who knows where this information is. Maybe it's been passed on to private corporations.
Well, yeah, definitely with, you had NIDS a few years back that got a lot of that information. But yeah, that's what the aviary, whatever exactly they were, was trying to do, or the UFO working group, or these different folks were involved with from different agencies. They were trying to share information, and they all had, perhaps different pieces of the puzzle. They're trying to come together. What do we know,
It's frustrating. They've had on Jimmy Kimmel, President Clinton, President Bush, I think even President Obama, and he will ask them, are we being visited? Are we alone? And of course, they won't tell him. Each of the three presidents said, well, I know some things and I'm not going to tell you. In 2016, Jeb Bush was campaigning somewhere at an event for the public, and he brought in his father, mostly confined to a wheelchair. And a man stood up and says, I have a question. Can you tell me about UFOs? Are we being visited or not? And the elder Bush snapped, I know some things, and I'm not telling you. And this guy, he will not talk. Yeah,
that's the punch. That's the punchline, though. If you want to screw with people, who knows?
Yeah. And so they hustled this guy who asked the question right on out of the building. They didn't want to hear from him anymore, but it was caught on camera. And Elder Bush admitted that, as head of the CIA and as president, he knows some things, but he's not telling you.
You were talking about Trump, and during the campaign, somebody asked him. It's on. Do you hear me? Okay, my mic got shifted there.
Yeah, you're fine.
But somebody asked him, and you might find it on YouTube. It's just a little snippet. What he thought about ETs, UFOs, and his answer was, "I'm not a fan."
Well, that doesn't sound too encouraging, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Oh, that's the typical Trump answer. It didn't interest him, It's like,
yeah, well,
I'm not a fan.
Yeah,
this was during the campaign period.
They're going to have to land on his golf course to get his attention, I guess.
And pay him to do that, then yeah.
Well, that's just it. Yeah, he'd be interested if there was a way that he could make a profit off of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but since there's no discernible way to make money, he says like, yeah, not a fan.
Getting into politics here. Oh my God.
Yeah. We'll start getting phone calls and stuff. Okay. Well, now we've got a question from Trevor. And Trevor wants to know, so what do you guys think about the Tom DeLonge and his new project?
My attitude is wait and see. I know he's gotten a lot of criticism, and it is a little strange. He's asking for money right up front, but we'll see how it goes. I'm from Missouri. You got to show me.
Ditto. Well, part of it looks like a money-making enterprise because he has this whole program lined out for years to come. There's going to be movies, there's going to be books. He's working with different authors, and he's supposedly talking to insiders and this and that. And I'm quite dubious we'll see anything of merit.
Well, once again, though, I mean, here we have somebody who claims that they have this. They're getting insider information. Yeah.
It fits the pattern we've seen before.
Yes, and it's the same pattern repeated over and over and over again from people who do not keep up on their history, their UFO history.
Well, I would. It's a new way of marketing it, though. You go through phases in ufology where you, like at UFO conference, you see the same people, the Stanton Friedmans and all of that. And so this is like branding it with somebody who's like a millennial or close to a millennial. He has a background as a rock star, so maybe that can attract a new audience. Maybe that's the design.
Well, that would be nice. I mean, I always encourage new blood to come in and to bring in hopefully some fresh ideas. But it's not going to happen if they aren't familiar with where everything is coming from.
I wasn't necessarily framing it as a good thing, but just as a marketing mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, but face it. I mean, what's one of the major things that most UFO investigators always, bitch about is that they don't have any money to do any proper research. And so, I mean, I can't blame somebody from wanting to find a funding source.
Well, he's a popular rock star. Doesn't he have a lot of money already?
How popular is he? Come on. What was the group that he was with?
Blink 182, was that it?
Yeah.
So somewhat popular, I guess. He's a well-known rock name and now UFO name, but it just seems very strange. One of the first things he wants is for you to write a check to him, and we're thinking, well, shouldn't you produce some evidence first? And the evidence will come after you join our group. So
I mean,
look out for yourself.
The money that's going to be generated is like peanuts compared to real money, put into scientific research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and then that's always been the problem when it comes to UFO research. So it's mostly just grassroots people spending their own money to do the research. And if any breakthrough is made, it's probably not going to come from UFO researchers, as Adam and Greg Bishop says. It's probably going to come out of left field somewhere, and then when it does, UFO researchers, I mean, they're going to be cast to the wayside. It's then going to be the scientist or whoever who are going to come in and like, yeah, we do it all along. And this is why. And all the hard work that people, have done over the years, it won't mean anything, but as I said before, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't expect to see any change in the whole UFO phenomena or the information gathering or knowledge base in my lifetime. So we'll leave it at that and go to our bottom of the hour break. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation on exploring the bizarre.
Now back to exploring the bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
All right, welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre. Here we are at the bottom of the hour. Time is rapidly running out. So, Paul, we were talking about Tom DeLonge and his new project. Do you think that, for the most part, that people care one way or the other about UFOs and whether or not they're real or not?
That's a pretty good question. I think basically deep down, everyone is curious what our place is in the universe and if we're being visited. As you heard Jimmy Kimmel, he wants to know, so he asked directly to the presidents. I think it's something that's in most people's minds, but not at the forefront. Just struggling to earn enough money to survive keeps us pretty busy in this crazy world.
Now the characters in your book. I mean, what is money their motivation for everything?
It certainly is for the lead character, who's a good guy, but he's got a gambling problem. So he creates these alien races at the ballpark, and he fixes them to make sure his bets win, and he gets mixed up with some cutthroat gamblers and loan sharks, and it gets a little complicated, but he wins out in the end, as should happen in any good novel. But I do try to get into real-life stories. One is from, maybe you're familiar with, on April 18th of 1962, a UFO was sighted over 10 states, flashing from New York to Utah, where it was seen landing in a small town called Eureka, and the power went out, and then it lifted up and took off in a different direction, and flew over Las Vegas and was photographed in the Las Vegas Sun at that time, and it crashed near Mesquite outside of town. And I've got a friend who went to college in the 1980s in Las Vegas, and he said he decided to look into this story, and he's going to get the scoop for his college newspaper. And he went to interview the photographer for the Vegas Sun, and the man just blew up. He just exploded after being very friendly at first. Don't talk about this subject. I don't want to hear about it. Get out of my shop, and threw him out of his store. And by the time my buddy got home, he got an ominous phone call saying, you don't want to go into this story. You're not going to be writing about it. This is how people end up dead. This ominous voice knew my friend's name. He knew his parents' name, threatened them as well, and it scared him shirtless, shall we say, for a family audience. And it just goes to show you that apparently the government knows about this 62 story, kept covering it up for over 25 years later, and maybe it goes on to this day, and I think people really want the lid blown off of these kinds of tales and just have our government be honest with us. Is that too much to ask?
No, of course not. But, it makes me wonder, though. I mean, what would it have been about that story that would be deemed, so secretive. And see, to me, the whole aspect of the anonymous phone calls or warning against further investigation, to me, just really inflames the story. It makes it even juicier as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I made sure to put it in my book, and I told it quite truthfully, and I ran a copy of this chapter past my friend, and he approved it. It really did happen. He swears it's true. However, he has no proof. Just like a UFO witness, he has no proof to this call. But he said he was really, really scared when this happened, and he did drop the story, needless to say. And it's been somewhat under-investigated. I know Kevin Randall has looked into it and done some good work. You can find it on the internet. And I made sure to include that since it's a great Vegas area story in my new book, Sexy Alien Races from Argus Publishing.
Which again, it makes me wonder why the threats, why this type of secrecy. It's the same thing, say like with the Men in Black stories, where you have a UFO witness or an investigator, and then suddenly they're visited by these mysterious men, or they receive threatening phone calls or threatening letters. See, now to me, that just goes and confirms that this person is on the right track. That
Right.
something definitely is going on. Rather than if nobody said anything, if no threats were made or anything like that, the story would then just eventually peter out. But I mean, here you're talking about the Las Vegas photograph, 1962. We're talking about it now in 2017, when possibly if your friend hadn't received any kind of threats or anything like that, nobody would talk about it.
That's correct. It initially appeared in some newspapers because it was such a prominent UFO at the time, this strange thing that had different colors, and some said it was cigar-shaped. And that happened April 18th. The next day, it hit some newspapers, and then dead silence. No one seemed to be capable of getting the story out, or maybe they were warned off back then. I looked up JFK's White House records. Where was he at the time? Did he suddenly have a bunch of meetings with military men? And unfortunately, he was just flown to Palm Beach, Florida for the Passover Easter holiday at the time, and there were no records of his phone calls or visitors during like a week-long idle in South Florida. So the whole story just seems to be somewhat dead, but the official story was that, it was just a meteorite. But if it was, why was the sheriff of Clark County surrounding Las Vegas forming a search party and was denied access by the military to go investigate this property, which was government land, which is in reality not unusual because the government owns a tremendous amount of land in the state of Nevada. They were not allowed to pursue this story and were told to just forget it, go home, and there's nothing to it. And they were concerned at the time, but you just did what your government told you then and in the 1980s. And I don't know what the reaction today would be. I think people would maybe get more organized and send up some drones or get in an aircraft or a helicopter and challenge the government and say, what are you going to do, shoot me down? I'm not sure if I would want to do that if I were you, but times have changed.
The politicians will just declare it fake news and
Yeah.
go on to something else.
You could have burning wreckage and dead aliens, and someone would say, "Nothing to see here. Move along. Nothing to see here."
Well, what other stories have you incorporated in your fictional book, but events that actually happened?
I didn't want to get too much into channelers, abductees, or contactees. We've talked about them a little tonight. I get into a little bit of that, but I included a little-known story from January of 1942, in which a shining amber or yellow-red object was seen over the mountain 30 minutes before Carol Lombard's airplane crashed into it. And then witnesses said it just hung there like a lantern in the sky. This is long before drones or blimps or something like that. And it said after the crash, it took off immediately and just disappeared. And that FBI reports on this amazing story were blacked out and kept from the American public for over 40 years before they were grudgingly released, redacted in the 1980s. But what little that does remain talks about these lights that were seen by witnesses. And, I think it's a writer, is her name Leslie Kean, has written an entire book about airplanes getting too close to UFOs and losing their power. And you saw this in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind with Steven Spielberg, like Richard Dreyfuss's truck suddenly goes dead and an entire neighborhood loses its power, and airplanes lose their power when they get in too close a contact with these supposedly alien technology. So this may be something that happened in real life. Carol Lombard and 21 others died when their plane crashed into a mountain, a snow-capped mountain, on a clear, unlimited visibility evening in January of 42. And apparently the FBI investigated thoroughly, and they did not want the American public to hear about this. And it's still an under-investigated tale, and I made sure to include plenty of that in my book.
Yeah, I remember that that story because apparently the mountain that the pilot crashed into, well-known mountain, and the pilots who flew that route regularly were very well aware that it was there and steered clear of it.
They were warned repeatedly, don't go anywhere near this mountain. And so what does he do? He drives right into it.
Flies right into it,
So he had done takeoffs from the Las Vegas airport a number of times before, and so had his co-pilot. They had perfectly working instruments, according to the crash wreckage recovery investigation. But one eyewitness said he saw the airplane lost its power. You couldn't see the lights on in any part of the plane, and it was struggling going into what he called porpoise dives in the air, struggling to get level and going into a so-called flat spin, which had to have been absolutely terrifying for anyone on board. And it was the early days of World War II. It was bad news. We don't really want to spread this around. It's scary sounding and it's depressing. So I think that was another factor in the government squelching an amazing tale.
You mentioned that in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the scene where Richard Dreyfuss' truck is frozen in place by the UFO, and this used to be something that was repeatedly reported from a lot of UFO witnesses, that their car would just suddenly stop, and it wasn't like it just like the engine failed. It was like it was frozen almost in place, because when the UFO would disappear, a lot of times the car would start right back up again on its own accord. The witness wouldn't try to start the car. It would start on its own.
Steven Spielberg did a lot of research with Dr. Jacques Vallée on real-life stories like this and made sure to include them prominently in Close Encounters, and you can still see it for this day. I trust you will get Steven Spielberg on your show so he can tell us.
Oh, of course, yeah. I think Adam has that connection. He'll set it up.
Oh, yeah, right. No, great movie. Isn't that the greatest movie?
It is. It is. When it came out, I think I probably saw it at least 10 times in the theaters. Yeah,
just the special effects for that time. It was like, whoa, yeah.
It probably opened a lot of minds and got people thinking about the possibility that we are being visited. It was a real landmark film with a big budget and so well done. You wonder, what does Steven Spielberg really know? Within the last year or two, he came forward and said that Ronald Reagan's story was true. It really did happen. Do you want to repeat that one of the showing of E.T. in the White House and what Reagan said?
Wasn't that the one where Reagan, I guess, leaned over to Spielberg and said a lot of this movie is more true than you think, or something along those lines?
Right. He said something like, "This is more real than you know." And Spielberg refused to comment on it for like 2 decades or more. And then within the last year or so, he came forward and said, that story is absolutely true. Reagan was not joking when he said it either. Of course, Mr. Reagan is deceased, and he can't stand up for himself.
Yeah. Oh, but Reagan was obviously, seemed to be a believer, maybe not necessarily in UFOs, but in the idea of a possibility of extraterrestrial life, because he made that reference several times, where he would talk about what would happen if we were invaded. By extraterrestrials, and right. would like say the United States and the Soviet Union continue fighting with each other, or would we band together to fight a universal threat?
If we were threatened by an alien force. You notice he didn't give those speeches until he had won a second term. Then he didn't give a hoot anymore, and he made a number of these references, and then suddenly just stopped, and that was the end of that. Someone must have talked to him and said no more of that. It could have been his wife Nancy, who was very protective of his reputation, though.
No, we had
Nancy was an ET.
There you go. Yeah. We had Grant Cameron on our show not too long ago, and Grant made reference to the stories that when a president is first elected and when he's debriefed when he first goes in, they're told basically two things: don't ask about UFOs, don't ask about the Kennedy assassination.
Well, that gets back to Trump and the whole after he and Obama met at the White House, he had this look on his face. It was like, whoa, you never saw Trump so subdued. So everybody's saying, what the hell did Obama tell him? Did he tell him about the ETs, which Dave Chappelle mentioned on SNL? I doubt if it was the ETs. It was probably Obama telling him, we have all the recordings of you talking to the Russians.
That would subdue him pretty quick.
No, he was told that his wife Melina is actually an extraterrestrial.
You know the what I'm talking about, though. He's meeting there in it's not the Oval Office or whatever they meet in Trump. It's the most subdued he ever looked in his life.
Oh yeah, I know.
What the hell did I get myself into?
Well, I think. Go ahead, Paul.
We have one advantage with Trump. He's not from the military. He's not from the government. He has nothing to do with intelligence. But
he does have the nuclear codes, though.
Yeah. But he's not beholden to any of these interests, and he could someday just blurt something out, especially if he thought he was going to resign or be impeached. He might just release some data. You never know.
At this point, who would believe anything, though?
Yeah, and again, we're brought back to that again. Who would believe him? It's like Adam pointed out. You'd have a few who would believe anything that he said. I mean, if he said that Deros were living in the sewers of New York, there'd be quite a few people who oh yeah, I've seen them, I believe it. But it's like the whole disclosure movement. If the government would come out and disclose something, there would always be groups and factions who wouldn't believe it because the disclosure wouldn't fit within their belief system.
Yeah, either end of the spectrum, the whatever believers of Trump, the disbelievers, they're all stuck in their own. They've made up their minds. So yeah.
One person who intrigues me would be Joe Biden, who served in Senate Intelligence Committees for decades, and then he was vice president, probably received a lot of presidential briefings, and yet no one ever seems to ask him, and he never pipes up with his own information. I don't think he's going to run for office anymore. Maybe he would be willing to talk. I don't have much hope for Mike Pence. He seems very straight-laced.
Well, yeah.
To him, yeah, he'd throw you out of the room, I'm afraid.
Well, Paul, I live here in Indiana, and I had the misfortune at times in the past to have to work with Pence before he was governor of the state. Oh yeah. Well, I mean, don't forget, I spent 20 years in the news game,
television.
So, yeah. So I mean, I worked with all of them. So, and you're right. I mean, unless there was a religious aspect to the UFO phenomena, Pence wouldn't have anything to do with it.
Unless, and that the ET was Jesus.
Right. Yeah. Oh, there you go.
What about the old scenario? What if aliens really did land on the White House lawn? What would happen? What do you think? Would they be shot at?
Military effort. It would something. A lot of heavy stuff would be going down real fast.
You'd have a lot of people with their cell phone cameras out recording. Yeah. So you'd have to be a security nightmare if you wanted to keep it quiet and hushed. I think the news media would be all over that. They're in the building quite a bit. So
I bet there would be explosions real quick.
They would be surrounded by armed men, no doubt.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, maybe the artillery would bounce off the saucer or whatever, but
Tina, our producer, she said people would say it was a false, or the government would say it was a false flag, holographic testing. Yeah,
of course, yeah.
Well, it'd be like that scene from the old movie, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, where they land in the White House.
The day the Earth stood still.
Right. Just anybody that would come out just immediately would be shot down. Well, unfortunately, gentlemen, we have about less than 3 minutes before we have to say bye-bye. So, Paul, I want to give you the opportunity to tell us about your new book, where people can find it, and what's going on next with you.
I've written the book, and I'm working on the sequel to Sexy Alien Races, and we'll bring the same characters back, and they were a lot of fun to write for. It was a hoot to write, and I hope you find it very funny. It's gotten a good review already from the first official book reviewer, and you can get a copy at aargusbooks.com, and you can still get copies of my Cape Girardeau UFO books there. And I'll be also writing about a nonfiction book on UFOs that will be covering a little bit on the Jackie Gleason story. As you say, Tim Beckley's interested in that, and I've got some material on that, but I still need to hunker down and get that done.
All right, fantastic. And Adam, what about you?
Just go to adamgorightly.com.
That says it all. And your your contactee book with Greg Bishop. How much longer do you think?
The beginning of next year. Hope most of it is done, written. The cover is done. I need to. The next stage is getting it into layout. So I think early next year.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been a fantastic show. A lot of interesting things discussed, and I just really appreciate you two being with me tonight. And for everyone out there listening, we appreciate you being with us. So stay tuned. We'll be back again next week. Hopefully Tim Beckley will feel better and be back. So good night all, and take care.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.